Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. People have been filling my comments asking for more stories from across the ocean, and I finally managed to gather 4 absolutely chilling accounts that took place in England. These aren't your typical urban legends or common ghost tales. They are real-life experiences that happen to real people. And honestly, after reading each of these accounts, I'm not sure I can look at the English countryside the same way again. Before diving into these stories, let me tell you something. England has a unique atmosphere that makes the terrifying feel even more intense. Maybe it's that fog that appears without warning, or those stone buildings that have withstood the passage of centuries. Or perhaps it's simply the way darkness completely takes over the moors and small towns. Whatever it is, when something frightening happens here, it feels different. I spent weeks verifying these stories, cross-checking details, and making sure they were as authentic as possible. What I found were 4 experiences that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about safety and tranquility. From the nightmare of a university student to the panic of a family in the countryside, these testimonies show how quickly an ordinary day can turn into your worst nightmare. The first story takes place in a well-known university in the heart of England, where a young woman experienced a study night that turned into something unforgettable. The second account tells how a hiking expedition in the Peak District went terrifyingly wrong. Our third story comes from a small village in the Cotswolds, where a shopkeeper witnessed something that defies all logic. And finally, we'll hear about someone who thought they were safe in their home until they discovered they weren't alone. What makes these stories particularly unsettling is the fact that they happen in places we generally consider safe by nature. Universities, hiking trails, peaceful villages, and even our own homes. These are spaces that should be sanctuaries, but for these people, they turned into scenes of genuine terror without warning. I must warn you that these accounts contain details that may be disturbing. If you scare easily, or if you prefer to sleep peacefully tonight, it might be better to save this video for another time. But if you're ready to hear some of the most chilling experiences that have taken place on English soil, get comfortable, because this is about to begin. Our first story comes from Sarah, a third-year literature student at the University of Cambridge. It was late October, and she was deep into research for her thesis, spending endless hours in the oldest library on campus. That building dated back to the 15th century, with narrow hallways, wooden floors that creaked at the slightest movement, and that distinctive smell of centuries of accumulated knowledge and secrets hidden between pages. Sarah preferred to study at night when the library was practically deserted. She felt the absolute silence helped her concentrate without the distractions of other students. The library stayed open 24 hours for postgraduate students, though very few made use of those late hours. Most of the time, Sarah felt like she had the entire building to herself. That night, she had taken her usual spot on the 3rd floor, tucked away in a corner between shelves full of medieval texts. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the building settling and the distant hum of the heating system. She had been working for about 3 hours when she first noticed something unusual. She heard a rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere nearby. At first, she thought it might be the pipes or the heating system. After all, old buildings always have their peculiar noises. But the more she listened, the more obvious it became that the sound was too constant, too intentional to be mechanical. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. It came from the reading room just around the corner. Sarah tried to ignore it and focus on her books, but the tapping persisted with that unsettling rhythm. After about 10 minutes, curiosity got the better of her, and she decided to find out what it was. She gathered her courage and walked toward the reading room. Her footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor. As she turned the corner, she glanced into the large, dimly lit hall, filled with heavy oak tables and chairs. The room seemed empty, but the tapping stopped the moment she appeared. Sarah stood still for a few seconds, watching closely. Everything looked in order. The tall windows revealed the darkness outside, and the reading lamps cast warm pools of light onto the empty tables. She was about to head back to her corner when something made her blood run cold. One of the chairs near the back of the room was rocking slowly, as if someone had just stood up from it. But no one was there. The rocking continued for a few more seconds before coming to a complete stop. Sarah felt the hair on her arms stand on end. She tried to convince herself it was a draft, but standing there, she couldn't feel any air movement. It's an old building, she told herself. It must have been the wind. She hurried back to her spot and tried to focus again, but it was impossible now. Every small sound from the building became threatening. The hum of the heating system sounded like whispers. The creak of the beams resembled footsteps in distant hallways. About 20 minutes later, the tapping returned, this time louder and from another direction, near the history section to her left. Sarah began trembling slightly as she held her pen. This sound wasn't coming from pipes. It was too precise, too much like someone deliberately trying to get her attention. She thought about packing up and leaving, but her deadline was close, and she couldn't afford to waste time. Besides, she told herself, it was probably just her mind playing tricks on her. Long nights and stress could do that, right? The tapping stopped, but what followed was even worse. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching along the hallway toward her section. They came from the main staircase and grew clearer with each passing moment. Sarah's heart was pounding. She knew the security guard made rounds, but he always announced himself and used a flashlight. These footsteps were different. They were quiet, almost stealthy, as if trying not to be detected. She checked the time on her phone, almost 2 in the morning. The footsteps were now just outside her area. They stopped abruptly, right at the edge of her section. Sarah held her breath. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent. And then, a new sound. The rustle of pages being turned. Someone was flipping through a book, but it wasn't at her table. The sound came from the adjacent aisle, just on the other side of the shelf separating her from the rest of the section. She listened as the pages were turned one by one, slowly, as if the person wasn't reading but searching for something very specific. Every instinct told her not to move, not to speak. There was something strange about this situation. The stealthy way the footsteps had arrived, the meticulous way the pages were being turned. This didn't seem like another student or a guard. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Sarah strained her ears, trying to figure out what was happening on the other side of the shelf. The silence stretched on for minutes that felt like hours. And then she heard something even more terrifying. Books being pulled out from the shelf between her and whoever was there. Not 1 or 2, but several, creating small gaps between the remaining titles. Someone was making spaces to see through. Sarah realized with horror that this person was making holes to spy on her. She watched in panic as the gaps appeared one by one, the books removed with care. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her pen. She had 2 options: confront the intruder or try to escape unnoticed. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she was trapped in her corner. To leave, she would have to pass right by whoever was on the other side. And then she saw it. An eye. A human eye staring at her through one of the gaps. It didn't blink, didn't move. It just stared, with an intensity that completely froze her. Sarah bit her lip to keep from screaming, tasting the metallic tang of blood as she bit hard enough to break the skin. The eye stayed there for what felt like an eternity. Sarah didn't dare breathe. She was trapped in a kind of silent standoff with someone who had been stalking her meticulously among the shelves. Finally, the eye disappeared. She heard the books being put back in place, closing the gaps one by one. Then the footsteps moved away down the aisle, fading slowly. She didn't move until she heard absolutely nothing else. With trembling hands, she silently packed up all her things. That was the last time she ever studied there at night. The next day, she told campus security what had happened, but they told her the building's surveillance cameras had failed that night, showing only static for several hours, exactly during the time she had described. To this day, Sarah has no idea who watched her that night or what their intentions were. She finished her thesis in other libraries and graduated that spring, but she still has nightmares about that unmoving eye staring at her from between the books. Our second story takes place in the Peak District, one of the most breathtaking national parks in England. James and his girlfriend Emma had decided to spend a long weekend exploring some of the area's more remote trails. Both were experienced hikers and had been roaming the British countryside together for years. They chose an especially challenging path that would take them deep into the moorland, far from the routes most tourists traveled. The weather forecast was favorable, and they expected to enjoy a quiet few days surrounded only by nature and each other. The first day of hiking went smoothly. They covered a good distance, admired spectacular views, and by nightfall, they pitched their tent in a beautiful valley. They prepared dinner on their portable stove, shared a bottle of wine, and drifted off to sleep to the sound of the wind gently swaying the grass like a lullaby. But it was on the second night that everything took a turn. James woke up around 3 in the morning to a sound he couldn't immediately identify. It was a low, steady noise coming from outside the tent. At first, he thought it might be an animal, perhaps sheep or cows, which often grazed in the area. However, as he listened more closely, the sound became unsettling. It was as if something heavy was being dragged along the ground, moving in circles around the campsite. The dragging would stop for a moment, then continue, always following the same circular pattern. James nudged Emma awake and whispered for her to listen. She heard it immediately, her eyes widening in concern. Both of them lay inside their sleeping bags, trying to figure out what could be making that noise in the middle of nowhere. The sound persisted for another 10 minutes and then stopped completely. James and Emma stayed silent, tense, waiting to see if it would return. When nothing else happened, they eventually managed to fall back asleep, convincing themselves it might have been a sheep tangled in something, or maybe some trash being blown by the wind. But the next morning, when they stepped out of the tent, they were met with a sight that froze them in place. Indeed, there was a circular pattern in the grass surrounding their campsite, but it wasn't the work of wind or any animal. Someone had walked around their tent repeatedly during the night, dragging something heavy with them. The grass was flattened into a perfect circle about 20 feet from the tent. Whatever had been dragged left deep grooves in the soft earth, and in some muddy spots, they could clearly see boot prints. Someone had spent quite a bit of time prowling around their camp while they slept, completely unaware of how vulnerable they were. James examined the footprints more closely and felt his stomach turn. The prints were large, probably a men's size 12 or 13, and showed slow, deliberate steps. It didn't look like someone who had stumbled upon them by accident. Judging by the pattern, it seemed more like someone had been watching them, like a predator studying its prey. Emma wanted to pack up immediately and head back to civilization, but James convinced her to stick to the plan. The footprints were already several hours old, and whoever had made them was likely long gone. Besides, maybe it had just been another curious hiker, right? That day they continued deeper into the moor, but the unease never left them. Every time they stopped to rest, James couldn't help scanning the horizon for human figures. The landscape was wide and open with few places to hide, which in theory should have made them feel safer. But somehow that very exposure made them feel even more defenseless. By evening, they found another good spot to camp, this time near a stream and surrounded by large rocks and low trees. Emma insisted they take turns keeping watch during the night, and James reluctantly agreed. Emma took the first shift while James tried to sleep. She sat in front of the tent with a flashlight in hand, alert to every sound of the night. She could hear owls in the distance and small animals rustling through the undergrowth. But around midnight she heard something else. Footsteps. Slow and careful, approaching from the same direction they had traveled earlier that day. Emma's heart began to pound as she realized someone was following their trail, moving toward the camp under the cover of darkness. She woke James immediately. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out with her. They both listened closely, and sure enough, the footsteps kept coming. This time, whoever was approaching wasn't trying to be discreet. They walked with confidence, as if they were fully in control of the situation. James called out into the darkness, identifying himself as a hiker and asking if the other person needed help. The footsteps stopped instantly, but there was no reply. The silence stretched on for several minutes before the sound returned. Only now the footsteps began tracing a wide circle around the camp, just like the night before. Every so often, when they swept their flashlights around, they caught a glimpse of a figure in the shadows. It looked like a tall man dressed in dark clothing, but he always stayed at the edge of the light's reach. Whenever they tried to shine directly on him, he would slip back into darkness, avoiding a clear view. The stalking went on for over an hour. The figure circled the camp, paused for long stretches, then continued. He never came close enough for them to see his face, nor did he try to speak. He just watched and waited, as if evaluating, or waiting for the perfect moment to act. Finally, around 2 in the morning, the presence vanished. James and Emma didn't dare leave the tent until daylight. When they finally did, they found the same circular pattern of footprints around the camp. But this time, there was something else. About 50 feet from the tent, someone had built a small pile of stones. They were carefully stacked into a little cairn nearly 3 feet tall. It hadn't been there when they set up camp, and the most disturbing part was its location. From that spot, there was a perfect view of the tent, while also providing cover for someone to hide behind. James and Emma packed quickly and left the Peak District that same morning, cutting their trip short by 2 days. They reported the incident to the local police, who took note of their statement but explained that the moor was a vast, sparsely monitored area. Without more precise information about the suspect, there was little they could do. Months later, Emma read a news story that made her stomach drop. Another couple had reported being followed and watched while camping in the same region of the Peak District. In their case, the stalker had actually entered their tent while they slept, rummaging through their belongings before disappearing into the night. The police investigation revealed that someone had been living in rough conditions on the moor for a long time, surviving by stealing from campers and hikers. They found several hiding spots where stolen gear was stored, as well as signs of long-term occupation in remote areas. They never managed to capture the culprit, and as far as anyone knows, that man could still be out there, somewhere in the lonely stretches of the moor, watching, waiting, and preparing for his next unsuspecting victim. Our third story comes from Margaret, a woman who ran a small antique shop in a picturesque village in the Cotswolds. Her shop occupied the ground floor of a building that dated back to the 17th century, while she lived in the apartment upstairs. It was the kind of place you might see on postcards or tourist brochures. Honey-colored stone buildings, rose vines climbing up the facades, and a charm seemingly frozen in time. Margaret had been running the business for nearly 15 years and was convinced she knew every creak and sigh of the old building. She had learned to live with its quirks, like the door that never quite closed properly, or the floorboard in the back corner that always squeaked when stepped on. Everything began to change on a gray Tuesday in November. Margaret arrived as usual to open the shop and immediately noticed that several items were not where she had left them the night before. A Victorian jewelry box normally displayed on the main counter was now sitting on a shelf near the window. A silver ornate hand mirror that usually rested in the back of the shop had been moved to a table near the entrance. At first, Margaret thought perhaps she had moved the pieces herself and simply forgotten. She had been working long hours lately, and exhaustion could easily play tricks on her memory. She put the objects back in their places and went on with her usual routine, serving the few customers who stopped by on that quiet weekday. But the next morning, the situation repeated itself, this time in a more alarming way. Not only had small pieces been moved, but a heavy oak desk had been dragged several feet from its original position, and a collection of antique books had been taken from their shelf and arranged in piles on various tables around the shop. Margaret began to fear that someone was breaking into the shop at night. She carefully inspected all the doors and windows but found no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, and the old alarm system she had installed showed no record of being triggered. That very night, she decided to stay late in hopes of catching whoever was responsible. She set herself up in the back room where she had a clear view of the main shop area. She turned off most of the lights, leaving only a few dim lamps on so she could see if anyone entered. For the first few hours, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Margaret began to feel foolish for suspecting an intruder. The shop remained perfectly still, just as it should be at that hour. She was about to head upstairs when she heard the first noise. It was a faint scraping, as if something heavy was sliding slowly across the wooden floor. Margaret peeked her head out from the back room and felt her breath catch in her throat. The Victorian jewelry box was moving across the counter on its own, slowly gliding from one end to the other with no one touching it. As she stood frozen in disbelief, other objects began to move as well. The silver hand mirror lifted into the air and floated gently before resting in a new spot. Books started sliding out of their shelves, their pages fluttering as if stirred by an invisible breeze, even though the air inside the shop was perfectly still. Margaret wanted to run, to race upstairs and lock herself in her apartment, but her legs wouldn't respond. She was completely frozen, unable to take her eyes off the impossible scene unfolding before her. The movements weren't random or chaotic. They had a methodical quality, as if some unseen presence was reorganizing the shop according to a very specific pattern. The activity continued for nearly an hour. Large and small objects alike changed places with an uncanny precision. Margaret watched as a solid wooden chair slid across the floor, its legs moving in a coordinated way. She saw porcelain teacups lift gracefully into the air, tracing elegant arcs before being set down delicately in new spots. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. Silence once again claimed the shop, leaving only the physical evidence of the strange rearrangement she had just witnessed. Margaret stayed hidden in the back room for another hour, paralyzed with fear, before finally summoning the courage to step out and inspect the shop. Everything that had been moved was placed exactly as it had been the morning before, and the morning before that. The pattern was identical, suggesting that this invisible force had been repeating the same routine for several nights. It was then Margaret realized she wasn't dealing with a simple break-in. In the nights that followed, she witnessed the same phenomenon unfold with near mathematical precision. Each object moved to the same spot as if following a perfectly rehearsed choreography. She considered calling the police, but what would she tell them? That her antiques were moving on their own? They would almost certainly think she was crazy. Instead, she decided to research the building's history in hopes of finding an explanation. What she found in the village archives took her breath away. In 1847, the building had been the scene of a tragic event. A young woman named Eleanor Whitmore worked as a seamstress in the very space Margaret's shop now occupied. Eleanor was known for her obsessive attention to detail and her almost compulsive need to arrange and rearrange her workshop according to precise patterns. According to records, Eleanor had died there under unclear circumstances. Her body was found one morning seated at her work table, surrounded by her sewing materials arranged with perfect geometric precision. The official report attributed her death to heart failure, but several witnesses claimed to have heard her moving around inside the workshop for hours after her death, as if she had continued organizing her space from beyond the grave. Margaret realized that what she was witnessing might be the manifestation of Eleanor's spirit, still compulsively rearranging her surroundings even in death. The antique shop's objects were simply the modern equivalent of Eleanor's sewing tools, and the invisible presence treated them with the same meticulous care as in life. With this new understanding, Margaret changed her approach. Instead of hiding to watch, she began speaking out loud on the nights the activity occurred. She introduced herself, explained that she was now the caretaker of the space, and asked if Eleanor needed anything. The response was immediate and unsettling. The movements became more precise, more deliberate. Objects began forming letters and words on the shop floor. The first message was clear: "Thank you for caring." Over the weeks, Margaret developed a strange but oddly comforting relationship with Eleanor's spirit. The movements continued, but now they were less chaotic and more collaborative. Eleanor seemed to understand that the space was no longer a sewing workshop, but an antique shop, and she began arranging the items in ways that surprisingly made them more attractive to customers. Margaret's business began to thrive like never before. Visitors often commented on how special the shop felt and how certain pieces seemed to call to them from their perfectly chosen spots. Margaret knew Eleanor was still there, watching over the place they had come to share, and strangely enough, that knowledge brought her peace instead of fear. Our last story comes from David, a software engineer who had recently moved into a renovated apartment within a Victorian terraced house in the city of Manchester. The building had been divided into 4 separate units, and David occupied the top floor. He was delighted with the place: high ceilings, original architectural details, and abundant natural light streaming in through large windows. Most of the time, he worked from home and quickly settled into a routine in his new environment. The building was generally quiet, with respectful, discreet neighbors. He felt comfortable and safe in his new home, which made what happened next all the more unsettling. It began with small things that he initially attributed to coincidence or forgetfulness. Some objects in his apartment would appear in slightly different positions when he returned from running errands or when he woke up in the morning. A coffee mug he'd left on the kitchen counter would be on the dining table. A book that had been on the shelf would be lying on the sofa. Even his laptop would be rotated 90 degrees on his desk. David assumed that perhaps he was being careless without realizing it, moving things without remembering while on the phone or focused on work. But as these incidents became more frequent and obvious, he began paying much closer attention to the exact placement of his belongings. He started taking photographs of his apartment before leaving, creating a visual record to compare upon his return. The results were irrefutable. Someone was entering his home in his absence and deliberately rearranging his personal items. Realizing that a stranger was regularly gaining access to what he thought was his safe haven filled David with a mix of fear and indignation. He immediately changed the locks and decided to install a security camera system to identify the person responsible for this violation of his privacy. The footage from the first night was deeply disturbing. Around 2 a.m, a figure appeared in David's living room, but it was not a typical intruder. The person moved through the space with uncanny familiarity, as if they knew every corner of the home. They walked with confidence even in the dark and seemed to know exactly where everything was. The most unsettling part was that the figure appeared to be an elderly woman, small and frail, wearing what looked like a nightgown. She spent nearly an hour inside the apartment, moving David's belongings with surprising meticulousness. She handled them with a delicate, almost maternal care, as if tending to the possessions of someone she deeply cherished. David watched the video with growing unease. This was not vandalism, nor was it theft. The woman's behavior suggested a profound emotional connection to the place, or perhaps a painful confusion about where she belonged. Her movements were those of someone who believed she was in her own home. The next morning, David contacted his landlord to ask about the history of the building and its former residents. What he learned explained everything, and made the situation even sadder. The woman in the footage was Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who had lived in that very apartment for more than 40 years before being moved to a care facility 6 months earlier. Mrs. Hartwell suffered from advanced dementia, and according to her family, often became disoriented and sometimes wandered away from the center. Apparently, she still had a copy of the key to her old home and, in the midst of her mental confusion, would return to the place her mind still recognized as hers. To her, David's belongings were foreign items that she needed to move or rearrange to make space for her own possessions that existed only in her fading memories. David found himself in a delicate situation. Mrs. Hartwell was not a criminal, nor did she pose a threat in the conventional sense. She was a vulnerable woman whose mind was trapped in the past, trying over and over to return to a home that no longer belonged to her. Calling the police felt cruel, but allowing her to keep coming in wasn't an option either. In collaboration with Mrs. Hartwell's family and the care facility staff, David helped find a solution. The locks were changed again, and the family placed familiar photos and objects in the care center to help Eleanor better orient herself to her new reality. David also agreed to visit her at the facility, where he showed her recent photos of the apartment, and with patience, tried to explain that she now lived somewhere else, safe and adapted for her needs. These visits seemed to bring her some comfort, and over time, the nighttime wandering episodes became less frequent. The experience taught David that sometimes the most disturbing invasions of our space don't come from malice, but from the tragic confusion of a mind that no longer distinguishes between yesterday and today, between what once was and what is now. These 4 stories from England show us that fear doesn't always stem from the supernatural or from crime. Sometimes the most unsettling experiences arise from the intersection of human fragility, the weight of the past, and the strange ways in which what has been lived continues to resonate in the present. Whether it's a stranger stalking you in ancient landscapes, a restless spirit who hasn't abandoned their earthly routine, or an elderly woman lost in her own memories, all these encounters remind us that we share our world with forces, visible or not, that we may never fully understand. The next time you find yourself alone in an old library, camping in the middle of nature, working in a historic building, or settling into a new home, remember these stories. Listen carefully to the sounds around you, trust your instincts when something feels off, and never assume you are completely alone, even in the most familiar places. England's long history has left deep marks on its landscapes and buildings, and sometimes those layers of the past seep into our modern world in ways as frightening as they are moving. These tales are a reminder that the past is never as far away as we might like to think. If you enjoyed these horror stories from English soil and want to hear more tales from around the world, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Let me know in the comments which of these stories affected you the most, and if you have any personal experiences, whether in England or anywhere else. I'd love to read them. Until next time, take care, stay alert, and remember, sometimes the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary secrets.